For 40 years, the U.S. government watched hundreds of its own citizens slowly die, not because it had no cure, but because it chose not to use it. Doctors knew, officials knew, the system knew, and everyone stayed silent. This is not a story about disease. This is a story about a decision. This decision did not begin with cruelty. It began with paperwork, with signatures, with meetings held in quiet offices, with polite language and professional smiles. It began as something that looked responsible, organized, and scientific. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service announced a new medical study in Macon County, Alabama, near the town of Tuskegee. Officially, it was described as a public health program designed to provide free medical care to a poor rural population. There was no warning. There was no controversy. There was no reason to suspect harm. Macon County was one of the poorest regions in the country. Most families lived off small farms or manual labor. Many homes had no electricity, no running water, and no access to regular medical care. Illness was common. Doctors were rare. Hospitals were distant and expensive. So when government doctors arrived offering free checkups, free transportation, and free medicine, the offer felt like a gift. They spoke with authority. They wore white coats. They carried official documents. They told the men they were being treated for something called bad blood, a vague phrase used at the time to describe fatigue, pain, weakness, infections, a term that felt familiar and harmless. It did not sound dangerous. It did not sound urgent. It did not sound fatal. But the men were not being treated. They were being selected. Out of roughly 600 men who joined the program, 399 were already infected with syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that slowly attacks the nervous system, organs, and brain. 201 were not infected and were included as a control group. None of the infected men were told they had syphilis. None were told it was contagious. None were told it could destroy their bodies or kill them. They were told they were sick. They were told they were being helped. They were told they were lucky. They were given small pills that did nothing. Placebos, tonics, aspirin, occasional examinations, enough activity to create the illusion of care, enough attention to maintain trust, enough interaction to keep them returning again and again. They signed papers they could not read. They trusted explanations they could not verify. They believed the government would not lie to them. Why would it? The doctors were polite. The nurses were kind. The visits felt official. The system looked legitimate. And legitimacy is powerful. It creates obedience. It creates silence. It creates acceptance. The men did not ask difficult questions because they had no reason to. The people in front of them wore the symbols of trust, and trust, once given, is rarely questioned. Behind the scenes, however, the study had a very different purpose. It was never designed to cure. It was designed to observe, to watch what happens when syphilis is left untreated inside the human body, to document how it destroys organs, to measure how long it takes for symptoms to appear, to record how people decline and die. And the men in Macon County were chosen not because they were ideal patients, but because they were ideal subjects. Poor, uneducated, socially invisible, politically powerless. They could be watched without resistance. They could be ignored without consequence. They could be sacrificed quietly. And so the experiment continued, not in secret, but in silence. For the men in the study, life continued as normal. They went home after each visit. They returned to their farms. They worked their fields. They raised their children. They trusted the doctors who smiled and shook their hands. But something invisible was already growing inside them. Syphilis does not kill quickly. It waits. It hides. It spreads silently through the blood, into the nervous system, into the heart, into the brain. At first there is no pain, just fatigue, just headaches, just weakness. Things that can be ignored. Things that can be blamed on age, on work, on stress. And so the men did not worry. They believed they were being treated. They believed the doctors would stop anything dangerous. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. Years passed. Symptoms began to appear. Some men lost their eyesight. Some lost control of their muscles. Some became confused, forgetful, unstable. They forgot names. They forgot faces. They forgot themselves. Wives watched their husbands change. Men who had been strong became weak. Men who had been calm became angry. Men who had been reliable became unpredictable. Children watched their fathers become strangers. But the doctors continued to reassure them. It's normal. It's part of aging. It's nothing serious. Just keep coming back. And they did. Because what else could they do? The doctors were the only authority they had. The men trusted them. The families trusted them. That trust was slowly killing them. Behind the scenes, not all doctors were comfortable. Some young physicians questioned the ethics. Some nurses whispered their concerns. Some asked quietly, "Why aren't we treating them?" The answer was always the same. This is important. This is science. This is bigger than any individual. And slowly, the discomfort faded. Because systems do that. They absorb doubt. They normalize cruelty. They turn silence into routine. Doctors stopped seeing men. They started seeing data, charts, numbers, trends. They stopped seeing husbands. They stopped seeing fathers. They stopped seeing human beings. They saw a study. And a study, once started, must be completed. That logic replaced empathy. That logic replaced morality. That logic replaced responsibility. Meanwhile, wives were becoming infected. No one warned them. No one protected them. Children were born with congenital syphilis, blind, deformed, sick. Families suffered without understanding why. They blamed themselves. They blamed God. They blamed fate. They never blamed the doctors. Because the doctors never looked guilty. The experiment did not just harm individuals. It poisoned families. It broke generational trust. It taught people that institutions cannot be questioned. It taught people that authority should not be doubted. It taught people to obey, even when obedience hurts them. And that lesson lasted longer than the disease. For 40 years, the study remained hidden. Not hidden in a vault. Not hidden behind locked doors. Hidden in plain sight. It appeared in medical journals. It was discussed at conferences. It was known inside professional circles. But it was never explained to the people who mattered most. The participants, their families, the public. Then, in 1972, something changed. A young public health worker named Peter Buxton began asking questions. He had seen the data. He had seen the records. He had seen that men were being deliberately left untreated, and he was disturbed. He wrote letters. He reported concerns. He asked superiors why treatment was being denied. The answers were vague, dismissive. We're monitoring it. It's complicated. It's important. So he went outside the system. He contacted the press. And in July 1972, a journalist named John Heller published the story. The headline shocked the nation. The government had knowingly allowed men to die. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. People were angry. Doctors were horrified. Politicians were embarrassed. The word experiment suddenly felt dangerous. Congress launched investigations. Hearings were held. Officials were questioned. Doctors were forced to explain themselves. And for the first time, the men learned the truth. They were not being treated. They were never meant to be treated. They were meant to be observed. Imagine learning this after 40 years. Imagine realizing that the people you trusted had watched you suffer on purpose. Some men cried, some were angry, some were silent, some were already dead. Families demanded justice. Lawsuits followed. The government agreed to a settlement. Survivors received compensation. Families received apologies. But no amount of money could restore lost health. No apology could return lost years. No hearing could undo broken trust. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States. He spoke to the survivors. He acknowledged the wrongdoing. He admitted the failure. But apologies do not heal scars that lasted a lifetime. The damage was not just physical. It was psychological, cultural, generational. Trust in medicine among Black Americans collapsed. Not because of rumors, not because of myths, but because of memory. Tuskegee became a warning, a reminder, a wound. It changed laws. It changed ethics. It changed how research is done. But it also changed how people see institutions. And once trust is broken, it never fully returns. The Tuskegee experiment did not end in 1972. It only stopped happening. Its consequences continued. The scandal forced the United States to confront something uncomfortable: that science without ethics is not progress. It is danger. Before Tuskegee, medical research in the U.S. operated with minimal oversight. Doctors decided what was acceptable. Institutions decided what was necessary. Participants were expected to obey. Consent was assumed, not asked, not explained, not verified. Tuskegee changed that. New laws were written. The concept of informed consent became mandatory. People had to be told the truth. They had to understand what they were agreeing to. They had to be free to refuse. Ethical review boards were created. Research had to be approved not just scientifically but morally. Risk had to be justified. Harm had to be minimized. Participants had to be protected. On paper, the system became safer. But paper does not erase memory, and memory does not disappear, especially when it is shared, especially when it is inherited. Tuskegee became part of collective identity, a story parents told children, a warning passed through generations. Be careful what you trust. Ask questions. Don't assume authority means safety. That lesson saved lives, but it also created fear. Many people avoided hospitals, avoided doctors, avoided vaccines, avoided clinical trials, not because they were irrational, but because they remembered. The experiment did not just damage bodies, it damaged relationships between communities and institutions. It taught people that the system could sacrifice them, quietly, legally, without consequence. And that realization changes how you see the world. Tuskegee also forced scientists to look inward, not just at what they could do, but at what they should do. It raised uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from research? Who bears the risk? Who decides what is acceptable? Who is protected? And who is disposable? Tuskegee answered those questions in the worst way possible. It showed that without accountability, power drifts toward abuse. That without transparency, harm hides easily. That without empathy, systems become machines, efficient, cold, indifferent. The experiment became a turning point, not because it was unique, but because it was exposed, and exposure changed the rules. Not because people became better, but because they became afraid of being seen, and sometimes that is enough. The Tuskegee experiment is often described as a failure of medicine, a failure of ethics, a failure of government. But in another sense, it worked exactly as designed. It collected data, it produced papers, it satisfied institutional goals. It continued for 40 years without interruption. It only stopped when it became visible. That is the most unsettling part. It did not stop because it was wrong. It stopped because it was seen, which means that without exposure, it would have continued. That truth forces an uncomfortable question. How many similar things are happening right now, unseen? Not identical, not as obvious, but similar in structure. Hidden behind complexity, justified by necessity, protected by language. We live in a world built on systems too large to see fully. Medical systems, technological systems, political systems, economic systems. They make decisions faster than people can follow. They affect lives more than people can influence. And they rarely stop themselves. They stop when they are stopped. Tuskegee reminds us that the danger is not only in cruelty, it is in indifference. It is in distance. It is in abstraction. When people become numbers, when suffering becomes data, when harm becomes acceptable because it is efficient. The experiment teaches us that evil does not always announce itself. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It does not look violent. Sometimes it looks professional. Sometimes it looks organized. Sometimes it looks responsible. Sometimes it looks like progress. And that is why it is so dangerous, because it feels normal. Tuskegee also reminds us that trust is fragile. Once broken, it echoes across generations. It shapes how people see institutions, how they see doctors, how they see government, how they see truth. And that damage is harder to repair than any physical wound, because it lives in memory. And memory lives longer than any document. The men who were used in this study are mostly gone now. Their names are not famous. Their faces are not remembered. Their stories are not widely told. But what happened to them changed the world, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. It was done by people doing their jobs, following procedures, obeying rules, and not asking questions. That is what makes it terrifying. Not that monsters exist, but that normality can become monstrous, and that systems can make cruelty feel reasonable. The lesson of Tuskegee is not, "This happened." The lesson is, this can happen again. Anywhere people are invisible, anywhere power is unaccountable, anywhere silence is rewarded, anywhere obedience replaces conscience. And that means the responsibility is not only institutional, it is human. It is ours. To question, to ask, to refuse when something feels wrong, to insist on transparency, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because once we stop doing that, history does not repeat itself. It continues.